Welcome to Had a Magical Day, the podcast about Disney parks that's like taking a vacation in the middle of your day. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Had a Magical Day. I'm your host, Scott Otto, and today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into one of my favorite things at the parks, the Disney Monorail. What'd I say? Monorail. What's it called? Monorail. Okay, I couldn't resist getting through this show without making reference to The Simpsons Marge versus the Monorail episode. Simpsons fans know what it is. For those who don't, it's actually nothing to do with the Disney monorail, but it's a takeoff on The Music Man, the musical. And it was actually written by Conan O'Brien, and he had the inspiration for it when he was in LA and he saw a billboard with just one word on it, monorail. Apparently, some very rich person who could afford a billboard was very enthusiastic about getting LA to build a monorail, which would have been extremely expensive. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, let's get back to the Disney monorail and talk about why I love it, because I think it's some of the same reasons Walt was so obsessed with building a monorail. So when I grew up, I was in the 70s. It was an era of a lot of optimism about the future and what technology could do. We just put a man on the moon. We were raised to believe that, growing up, by the time I was my age now, I would have flying cars and robots and be like the Jetsons. That didn't quite come to pass, but that was the attitude back in those days when Disney World was being built in 71. And even in the 50s, when Walt was building Disneyland, there's a lot of excitement about technology. Polio vaccines had started to eliminate the scare of polio that kids had to deal with and families. And you had the splitting of the atom. And you had nuclear power. And this was the nuclear family that was being generated in a great time for the middle class, even though you have the dangers of nuclear weapons. But so Walt was a big believer in technology and the ability of it to give us a better life and a better future. And that kind of permeates all the parks. There's this optimism that Walt had that is kind of built into the parks. And the monorail is one of those things. Walt, as you know, loved trains. He grew up was in Marceline, Kansas, and moved around. But the train was a big symbol of travel and seeing the world and technology at that time. And so Walt always had a love of trains. He had a model train and called the Carrollwood Railway in his home in California that you could sort of ride in. A human was about bigger than the car, but you could sit in some of the cars and ride it around. And he also had it at his Burbank office towards the end. So he loved trains and transportation. And besides being an animator and an artist and an inventor, he was kind of an urban planner at heart. And that's what he was trying to do with Epcot. And in fact, Marty Sklar, one of the famous Imagineers, said during the building of Disney World, Walt didn't work in the park at all. He didn't really bother with Magic Kingdom because it's the same as Disneyland, more or less. He was all focused on Epcot. That's all he cared about. So going back to the Disneyland and the monorail, he was always interested in transportations. And the monorail is more than just transportation. It's kind of a glimpse into the future. It's the reason why I love it, especially the one at Disney World, which is the Mark IV version when I first got there. It was so sleek a design and gleaming, and it screams like it's out of the future and it's going to take you to the future. And it's so smooth, and the sound it makes, that little whoosh as it goes by, it's just a great piece of technology. In fact, it's so smooth. I want to play this video of it for people watching on YouTube, but mainly for the audio, so you can hear the sound. This is a sound of a monorail passing overhead. Listen to how pleasing the sound is. It's just the nice hum of this, electric technology that's going to take you into the future. So anyways, that's why I love the monorail, and that's why Walt was such a big fan of it. It was, clean, it was futuristic, and a lot of different stories about how he got the idea for the monorail. It's clear he had the idea for the monorail long before he built Disneyland. Some people like to say it was because he went to this town in Germany that had a monorail, where the monorail actually was underneath the beam, and I'll show you that in a second. But I don't think that's really true. I'm getting a lot of my information from this book, which I should plug to start the show here. This is called the Disney Monorail, and it's a beautiful book. And the subtitle is Imagineering a Highway in the Sky. It's by Jeff Curdy, Vanessa Hunt, and Paul Walski. And it's a Disney book. So if you like Disney things in the monorail, you've probably had it targeted to you as an ad. And I can tell you it's a really very nice book, very well done, ton of great pictures, and everything you want to know about monorails is in there. But anyways, according to this book, Disney had the idea for the monorail. In fact, it's in a lot of the early drawings. This is before he went on the one in Germany. And I'm going to show you a video of that in a second. So in 1952, he went on there. If you go other places, they say like 58 he went on there. That's confusing the stories, which I'm going to tell you in a second here. So in 1952, Walt and Lillian were on vacation in Germany, and they went to this town of Wuppertal. And they went there because they knew this monorail was there and they wanted to go on the monorail. And I'm going to show you a video. There's a lot of videos of it online. You can find them all over the place. I'm going to share with you a very old video. This is from the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. Uh, they're there in New York. If you've ever been, you should support the museum. If you go to New York, it's a great museum. There's several of them. They also have a nice restaurant at the one in Midtown. Fellas, it's a good place to take a lady for a date. But let me show you this video. So this is black and white, but it's really amazing. So for people on the podcast, I'm just going to describe it very briefly. So it's a black and white footage, and you have a view from inside the monorail. So you can actually see the monorail that you're in, and you're just gliding along. You're hanging over this bucolic German village of the main thoroughfare. You can see another monorail coming at you. You see people in a horse and buggies going by underneath you, and it's just a beautiful little scene. In the video, the ride seems very smooth, but the legend is that they were on it, and Lillian got motion sickness. So when they got off the ride, and Walt loved it, they got off the ride, and Lillian said, "Why don't they put the cars on top of the track instead?" Because apparently it was swaying in the wind. Although most of the videos I see, you don't see a lot of swaying, but maybe it was a particularly windy day, or maybe this is just a story that Walt cooked up a little bit or embellished a little bit, because Walt is was a great storyteller. So that idea was in his head. He'd already been interested in monorails, which is why he went there on the ride. So, anyways, Disneyland opens in 1955. There is no monorail in Disneyland. Disneyland wasn't really complete when they opened it. They're up against a hard deadline. Tomorrowland, especially, was just kind of a hodgepodge of ideas. So that was okay with Walt because he always said the park would always be changing and growing. And so in 1959, they were planning a new kind of big reopening with lots of things being finished, and especially in Tomorrowland. And Bob Gurr, who's one of the Imagineers, who was assigned to work on monorails and other things there, he was saying like Walt already had the idea for a monorail and all the drawings for Disneyland prior to the opening and prior to even the 59 redo. They all had the monorails, and they were all with the cars on the bottom of the rail, just like the video you just saw if you're watching on YouTube. So it was later, it was actually 1958 on a second visit to Germany, where Walt, he liked to go on little adventures. So he didn't just do the touristy things when he went someplace. So they would just go for a drive, to just go out driving in some direction. And so on this fateful day in Germany in 1958, he goes for a drive with Lillian. They're going down some country road, and all of a sudden they come across a monorail up above. There's a monorail with the trains on top of the track going by, and Walt can't believe it, and he follows the track until the very end at the yard where the cars come off. And there's workers there. Nobody speaks English, but they somehow communicate and direct him back to the headquarters. So it turns out Walt had stumbled upon a German company that made monorails, and they had two campuses, and they had a monorail going between the two campuses, and that's what Walt had discovered on his little countryside drive. So he immediately struck a deal with these folks as Alweg, ALWEG was the company that made those monorails. He put them in touch with Joe Fowler and Bob Gurr, and they immediately started working on the monorail for Disneyland for 1959. So not a lot of time to suddenly build this technology, but at least they had a company that had already done it. Now, Bob Gurr, for people who don't know, he's a legendary Imagineer, still with us, God bless him. He did the cars in Autotopia at Disneyland. He did the antique cars on Main Street. He did the Matterhorn ride, and also this monorail, which is really one of his big claims to fame. So speaking about the optimism at this time with space travel and all this, I wanted to read from you, actually from the script of the original monorail in Disneyland. And it's quite an interesting relic of the time. So here it is. Before we glide off on the monorail train, I would like to call your attention to the Disneyland rocket ship behind us. which will take you on an interesting and exciting simulated flight to the moon. The rocket is 60 feet high and was built at the Disney Studios in Burbank under the technical direction of Dr. Werner von Braun. This is a scale model of what an actual rocket to the moon might look like in the future. It is interesting to note that Dr. von Braun helped develop simulated spaceflight for Walt Disney before he worked on such activities for the United States government. So, pretty amazing little piece of history there. Of course, they left out the part about Dr. Werner von Braun working for the Nazis, but Americans were happy to overlook that at the time if he was going to help us beat the Russians into space. So, anyways, Bob Gurr is tasked with doing this monorail along with Joe Fowler and some other folks. Joe Fowler, by the way, for people who don't know, he was kind of the man that was eventually put in charge of Disney World and put a lot of time in that. He's a military man, great planner. And so he oversaw all the plans for Disney World, and one of the steamships in Disney World that take you from the transportation center to Magic Kingdom is named after Joe Fowler. But anyways, they're working on this project, and as Disney often does, they decided to reuse past projects. So Bob Gurr had this idea that they could reuse some of the cars they'd used for the Viewliner. So the Viewliner was this kind of futuristic train that they had built in 1957 in Disneyland. It kind of ran alongside the Disney Railroad at most points on the track, but it also went in a separate direction at some points. And it lasted only about a year. And you can see here, it's kind of got a funky looking car shaped at the beginning cab. It almost looks like a Chrysler or something of that time, the 50s or so. And then the rest of these kind of sleek cars behind it were for the passengers. So Bob's idea was he's going to use that, but replace the thing at the front with something that looked like Flash Gordon's vehicle from the old serial movies that they had in, I forget what time, it was 40s or 50s, with Buster Crabbe. That had a wing on the top. He got rid of the wing on the top, and he decided to put a bubble on the top instead. So you can see the final product here, and it's kind of a sleek looking, very much 1950s sci-fi feel to the design of it. It's not quite as sleek and futuristic, a classic in my mind as the Mark IVs that they made for Disney World. But, it does look like that Buster Crabbe, Flash Gordon vehicle in the front. And you do have that bubble. And so in this picture, this is the very first ride of the monorail with the Nixon family as vice president in the front. And then Art Linkletter with his head in the bubble, which is where the conductor would be, and Walt himself next to it. So apparently, as they were building this thing, they're building in sections. People were working on it in sections. They really didn't have a place to test it all together until they finally put it on the track. So they'd have like a little a white sheet on each car with instructions for whatever engineer was doing, whether it was electrical work or whatever. And they would test it to see that the wheels moved and things like that. But when they put it together on the track, they were having trouble getting it to work. And so the story that I heard previously by an Imagineer was that they, right up until like the day that Nixon was supposed to show up, they weren't sure if it would actually run. Like they were having trouble getting it to run successfully. I feel like that might be exaggerated. I haven't really seen that story in other places. But anyways, the Nixon family came. They're the first guests. They're in the caboose. So, and this is the thing with the monorails. You could ride in the front, and it's really a spectacular view when you're in the front as opposed to being in the cars. And I got that experience when I was at Disney World. It was great when I was a kid. They don't do that anymore, and I'll get to that, why that is later on. But anyway, so the Nixon family's in front, and they hit the button, and they go, and it works, and everybody's relieved. And this was a red car. They only had one car there when they first started. It was a red one, and then later they added a blue. And these are what they call the Mark I monorails. So that was the first monorail. That was in June 14th of 1959, when the Nixon family was the first family to ride in the monorail. And that was also the first monorail in the United States. Monorails existed previously, but that was the first like full-time functioning monorail. There are things that were called a monorail in New York and other places that existed for a little bit steam-powered. But this is like considered the first real monorail in the U.S. There were some, as we mentioned, the one in Germany, that outside the U.S., but this was considered to be the first in the U.S. And you had the red car, and then later on they added the blue car and 3/4 of a mile of track. And so that was it. That was the Mark I design. Another interesting fact about this was that mentioned this Alweg company in Germany built these cars, or the one car, or the one train first, and then the second one. But they had a deal when Walt built the railroad. In fact, when he did most of Disneyland, he was making all sorts of deals to help defer costs. So he had the ABC show, which funded most of the Disney land, but he also did deals with vendors and stuff to be the official drink and etc. and run these different food stands. And so he made a deal with the Santa Fe Railroad that they would get to label all the trains in Disney World as Santa Fe Railroad. So there's a medallion on the original Disneyland monorail that said, Airwag / Santa Fe Railroad. So it had to get Santa Fe in there somehow. Interesting point about the monorail, the Disneyland, because I told you Walt loved trains so much and he so fascinated with the transportation that he created a separate company to run the monorail. And it was called Retlaw Enterprises, which is just Walter spelled backwards. And so technically, Walt actually owned the monorails. He owned the monorails and the trains and Disney and the Main Street vehicles as well. And he and Retlaw Enterprises, which was basically him, owned it until 1982 when they finally transferred it over to Walt Disney Productions. So that's how much Walt loved the trains and the monorails that he bothered to create a separate company just so he alone would be the owner. 2 years after the launch of the initial monorail, they came out with the next one, the improved Mark II monorail. And so let me talk a little bit about the evolution of the monorails at Disneyland, and then we'll get to Disney World. So for those watching the video, we're looking at the Mark I monorail. This is the blue one, which came after the red one. And it was 85 feet long and had 3 cars. And you had 2 trains, the red and the blue. And so that's the design and has that Flash Gordon front and has a little bubble on the top. So 2 years after the initial monorail, so 1961, they came out with a new improved Mark II monorail. So you're looking at here, and this is a new color. This is the third color in addition to the red and blue, they came out with this gold color monorail. And these trains were expanded to have 4 cars. So the look is basically the same look with the bubble top and the Flash Gordon front. But they have 4 cars each. And now instead of 3/4 of a mile, they had 2.5 miles of track because they connected it to the Disneyland Hotel. And so that was the main difference for the Mark II. It was mainly the color and the size. Now 4 cars, so they carry more people. And it went to the Disneyland Hotel and back to the park. Then in July 1969, the fleet was completely replaced with the new Mark III design. These were 137 feet long and had 5 cars. And now 4 colors. They added green to the red, blue, and gold. And they still had the bubble top, a slightly different bubble shape to it, a little flatter, a little longer. But otherwise, looks largely the same as the previous ones. And then in 1986, they had the Mark V design. Why did we go from 3 to 5? Because 4 was for Disney World, which had opened in 71. We'll get to that in a minute. Mark V, Disneyland, 1986. They've now changed the style to kind of match the ones at Disney World. So instead of having that Flash Gordon front to it, you kind of have a sleeker design, and it really has the same style windows and the stripe down the middle that the ones in Disney World had and still have. This is the Mark V. This is the only version of the Disneyland ones that was kind of the same as the Disney World one, because in 2008, they kind of went back to the old design. So while they've gotten rid of the bubble in Mark V, they still kept the bubble off the new design of the Mark VII, but it's much more like the original. It's got that same kind of front to it, the Flash Gordon front, but a little bit of a mix on the bodies of the cars in terms of the colors. So it is very much in keeping with the original, but it's kind of a better blend of kind of the 2 versions of it. But it still gives you that kind of more 50s science fiction feel as opposed to like the 70s futuristic design of the Mark IV over in Disney World and the Mark VI, which is the current one. So that's it. That's Mark VII for Disneyland in 2008, and that's currently what's there. There's no bubble, and there's only 3 colors, I think red, blue, and orange, and they're 140 feet long. So they actually went down in length compared to the previous one, which was 150 feet. And you'll see as we start talking about Disney World, these are all shorter and have less capacity than the Disney World ones. So when they were planning Disney World, and I mentioned Walt was really focused on Epcot, and they had this idea for the monorail. They wanted to be really futuristic, and they actually wanted to be automatic. Like they wanted these trains to be automatic, and you just push a button, be on demand. You'd push a button, and the monorail would come swooshing out and take you away. And in fact, this was kind of a rumor or something that I had heard when I first went to Disney World, that the monorails could run themselves. They didn't actually need conductors in them, but certain cultures wouldn't get on the train if they didn't have a driver in the monorail. And I have researched this. I'd heard this. I thought I heard it from actually somebody who worked at Disney World, one of the drivers, when I got to sit up front. But I have researched this. I cannot find that anywhere. I think that's a myth. So we're going to count that as a myth busted because there's all sorts of information about the safety measures that they do have for the trains. And when I looked into it, it doesn't seem like it was ever designed to run automatically without humans. Humans have always been there and will, I think, always will be there, even if they did really get it down. They have taken steps to make it more automated over the years, but there has always been a conductor and will always will be. So the dream of having it on demand with the push of a button never came to be. A little bit about the tracks that they made here. So they're 26 inches wide. They're concrete beam, but it's actually got a lot of styrofoam in it. It's styrofoam kind of encased in steel and concrete, and it's supported by columns that are 110 feet apart. I mentioned at the top about somebody wanting to build a monorail in LA and how expensive it would be. So another rumor or myth that goes around there is that it costs $1 million a mile to build a monorail track. That may have been the case in 71. I certainly heard that as well in the 70s when I went to Disney World. That may have been the case in $71. I don't know if that's true or not. Certainly in current dollars, it would be way more than that. There, you can find examples online of cities that have made monorails like Tokyo and China and these other places, and it's tens of millions of dollars per mile to build a monorail track. In fact, I know in the book, it doesn't say how much the concrete costs per mile, but the trains themselves cost about $7 million each. In Disney World, they made 10 trains. So that's a lot of money, $70 million of trains. The design difference, we talked a little bit about how the cars at Disneyland looked like 50s sci-fi because they are based on Flash Gordon. Bob Gurr, same designer, still around, still working for Disney, although he had his own company that did a lot of stuff for Hollywood. He decided he was inspired by the Learjet. And so he wanted that sleeker look, that modern 70s style look. And so he used that to redesign the front of the train and kind of make the whole train a little more sleeker and design than the original Disneyland monorail. So these are the Mark IV monorail, and they're 171 foot long. They were sleek gleaming. They had mid-level windows and 5 cars with 9 windows in each car. 10 trains were made by Martin Marietta in Orlando. And then 2 more were made by Disney themselves. And that's about the only ones that Disney made. They always had outside contractors like Alweg for the Disneyland ones. And then we'll see later on, there's another company that made the Mark VI versions. So 10 trains, if you're keeping track of colors, a lot of people love the different colors that they have. So there's red, blue, gold, orange, yellow, green, silver, black, purple, pink. And then in 78, they added lime and coral. There were 2 tracks initially, obviously for Magic Kingdom Resort and Express. If you've ever been there, those 2 loops. One has no stops other than the resort and the transportation center. The other one is stop for the hotels. And also they, in 1982, they built Epcot. Now the book says a 4-mile extension. And everybody says the total number of track now, total distance of track is 14.7 miles. I think it was 4 miles to Epcot and back because I've read elsewhere that loop around Epcot is like 7.5 miles, and the loops around the 2 inner loops around Disney were like 3 miles each. So that would kind of add up with the extra track around the transportation center to be about 14.7 miles. I think that's roughly what's going on if you look at a map. So I've talked about that pleasant whooshing sound that it makes as it goes by you. And what's powering that is actually that's truck tires. That's actually the wheels of the monorail, are truck tires. And so for some of you, if you ever looked up overhead, and I have a snapshot of this from a video I made, if you're watching the video on YouTube, you can see that you can clearly see the truck tires. You can see a couple of tires here as it passes overhead. But that's all it is. Like I said, they always kind of reuse different technology for these things. So truck tires are what drives the car. Of course, the motor drives the car, but it's using truck tires. That's what's going along the cement beam. And you can see the kind of the rubber wearing off on the beam if you ever look up at the beams. Okay, so that's everything about the Mark IV. The Mark VI, the second Disney World set of trains was 1986. Generally the same style, but these were not made by Martin Marietta. They were made by Bombardier Transportation, and these were bigger, 203 feet long, could hold roughly 364 people, and they had a top speed of 40 miles an hour. And the colors are largely the same: red, blue, gold, orange, yellow, green, lime, coral, silver, black, pink, and purple. And I'm going to tell you why you do not see pink and purple anymore. So that's kind of the history of the monorail. And now we're going to share some fun facts, including why there's no longer a pink and purple car and why you can no longer ride in the front of the Disney monorail. All right, so here are some fun facts about the monorail. So, top speed of 40 miles an hour, but of course, they usually have to go slower along the track. So, it's generally running between 15 and 35 miles per hour. The Disney World monorail has 150,000 daily riders. It's third in the world. This was as of 2016. Numbers might have changed slightly. That was third in the world compared to the Tokyo monorail, which they use, not to be confused with the Tokyo Disney monorail, which we'll get to in a second. And there's a town in China that also has a monorail as well. Tokyo has like 300,000 a day, and I think the China one has like 900,000. So Disney's not going to move up in the rankings anytime soon, but still, third most used monorail in the world. I never knew this before researching this episode. So there's an escape route for the monorail. It's like, what do you mean an escape route? Because you're on many parts of the track, you're just suspended over the up in the air. Where would you go to escape? And so it actually is you're supposed to go up to the roof. There's hatches that will allow you to, in an emergency, allow you to get on top of the monorail. So if there was something especially happening in the car, if there was an electrical fire or something, you would go sit on top of the monorail and wait for help to come. Hopefully that never happens to you. And it really rarely ever happens. Mostly if it has a problem, it's fine. It just you sit there on the tracks until they fix the problem. You don't actually have to get out of the vehicle. The highest point in the monorail path is actually at the Contemporary Hotel as you enter, and then as you go through, it's the same height, 60 feet in the air at that point. And in December 1986, the Disneyland monorail system, the original one that they built in 59, was named a National Historic Landmark by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. And I forgot to mention the Tokyo Disney one, because that was actually the biggest one. So that is 270 feet long, can carry 571 people. So that is the longest one out of all the monorails that they have. So that is basically. Oh, wait, I forgot the story about the pink and purple. Pink and purple were retired in 2009. Why? Because there had been an accident between the pink and purple trains. And so they crashed into each other. One of the conductors died. So it's not something Disney wants to talk about or have reminders of. So they got rid of those two trains. And they were later used to build the peach and teal ones that came out in 2011. And that is why they do not allow guests up in the front of the monorail anymore because of that accident in 2009. So that's the Mark 6. So you had red, blue, gold, orange, yellow, pink, and peach and teal. And those are the current colors that you can collect at the store if you buy the little monorail models. And I have a few of those behind me. But that's kind of everything you could possibly want to know about monorails. Oh, and I forgot before the show wraps up, I have to mention this. We've all the if you're watching the YouTube version, a lot of the images we shared were from davelandweb.com. They usually say so at the bottom of the image. You should check out that site. It's a great archive of all things Disneyland, the entire history of Disneyland. It's DAVELAND web.com. And Dave DeCaro, the guy who owns davelandweb.com, was nice enough to be a guest on our show. He was on episode 34. So check that out if you want to learn more about the history of Disneyland. That's it for this episode. We thank you for listening, and we'll see you real soon.